Rachel Thompson adjusted her red vest for the third time that morning. Checking her name tag was straight before walking to her station in aisle 7 of Henderson Hardware. The familiar scent of metal and motor oil greeted her as she began organizing. The wall of screws, bolts, and fasteners that had become her domain over the past 2 years. At 42, Rachel had grown accustomed to being invisible. Customers would glance at her briefly before their eyes searched for someone else, preferably male, preferably younger, to help with their serious projects. She'd perfected the art of blending into the background, speaking only when spoken to, keeping her head down, and doing her job with quiet efficiency. The morning started like any other. Mrs. Patterson needed help finding the right screws for her kitchen cabinet. Repair. Rachel guided her to the exact ones she needed, explained the difference between wood screws and machine screws, and even threw in a tip about pre-drilling to prevent splitting. Mrs. Patterson thanked her with genuine warmth, one of the few customers who appreciated Rachel's knowledge. But not everyone was like Mrs. Patterson. Around 10:30, a middle-aged contractor named Bill Morrison stomped in, his work boots leaving mud tracks across the polished floor. Rachel had dealt with him before. He had a way of looking through her as if she were part of the store fixtures. "Where's Danny?" he demanded, referring to the young part-timer who worked weekends. "He's off today, Mr. Morrison. Can I help you find something?" Morrison's eyes narrowed with irritation. "I need specialized masonry anchors for a commercial project. This isn't something for ... He gestured dismissively. ... Retail help." Rachel maintained her composure. "What load requirements are you working with? I can show you our selection of wedge anchors, sleeve anchors, or drop-in anchors, depending on your application." For a moment, Morrison looked surprised. Then his expression hardened. "Look, sweetheart, I've been doing construction since before you were born. Just get me someone who knows what they're talking about." The words stung, but Rachel had heard variations of this conversation hundreds of times. She nodded politely and called for Tom Bradley, her manager, over the intercom. Tom appeared from the back office, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "What can I do for you, Bill?" Morrison explained his needs while Rachel stood nearby, effectively dismissed. Tom, to his credit, glanced at Rachel with an apologetic look before walking Morrison to the exact same anchors Rachel had been prepared to show him. As she watched them disappear down the aisle, Rachel felt the familiar weight of invisibility settle over her shoulders. She returned to her station, straightening inventory that didn't need straightening, and tried to push down the frustration that had been building for months. The truth was, Rachel knew more about hardware and tools than most people in the store. She'd grown up helping her father in his workshop, learning the difference between a carriage bolt and a hex bolt before she learned to drive. But somewhere along the way, she'd learned that knowledge wasn't always enough. Sometimes, being heard required more than being right. What nobody at Henderson Hardware knew, what nobody in the small town of Millbrook knew, was that Rachel Thompson had once been someone else entirely. Someone who had commanded respect without asking for it. Someone whose word had been trusted implicitly in life-or-death situations. But that was before the discharge, before the nightmares, before she decided that blending into the background was safer than standing out. Tom returned from helping Morrison, shaking his head. "Sorry about that, Rachel. You know how Bill gets." "It's fine," she replied, her voice steady. It wasn't fine. But what else could she say? Tom hesitated, studying her face. In the 2 years Rachel had worked for him, he'd never seen her lose her temper or complain about unfair treatment. She absorbed every slight, every dismissal, every condescending comment with the same quiet dignity. Sometimes he wondered what she'd done before landing at his hardware store, but Rachel Thompson was intensely private about her past. "You heading to lunch soon?" Tom asked. in a few minutes. As Tom walked away, Rachel's hand unconsciously moved to her left shoulder, where a small tattoo lay hidden beneath her uniform shirt. The eagle, globe, and anchor were barely visible, a reminder of who she used to be, carefully concealed from who she was now. She had no way of knowing that her carefully constructed quiet life was about to be shattered by a group of young Marines who thought they knew everything about courage and combat, or that a single shot on a Saturday afternoon would force her to confront the person she'd been trying so hard to forget. For now, she was just Rachel Thompson, hardware store clerk. Invisible, underestimated, and exactly where she thought she wanted to be. The bell above the front door chimed as another customer entered, and Rachel straightened her shoulders, preparing for whatever came next. Tuesday afternoon brought an unusual chill to Millbrook, and with it, trouble in the form of 5 young Marines fresh from basic training at Camp Pendleton. They entered Henderson Hardware with the swagger of men who believed they'd seen the worst the world had to offer and conquered it. Their leader, a 20-year-old named Tyler Brooks, spotted Rachel immediately. She was kneeling beside a display of socket sets, checking inventory on her clipboard. Her red vest was slightly faded, her brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she had the unremarkable appearance of someone who'd perfected the art of not being noticed. "Hey, check it out," Brooks said loudly enough for his buddies to hear. "Think Grandma over there knows the difference between a rifle and a stapler?" The other Marines chuckled. Jason Webb, barely 19 with a sunburned face, elbowed his friend. "Probably thinks locked and loaded means her shift is over." Rachel's pen paused for just a moment on her clipboard, but she didn't look up. She'd learned that acknowledging this kind of behavior usually made it worse. Brooks approached her station with theatrical confidence. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "We need some specialized hardware for our barracks project. Military-grade stuff. You probably don't carry it here, but maybe you could point us toward the toy section." Rachel finally looked up, meeting his eyes with a calm expression that revealed nothing. "What specifically are you looking for? I might be able to help." The Marines exchanged glances and barely contained snickers. Marcus Rivera, the oldest of the group at 22, stepped forward. "We need vibration-dampening bolts for weapon maintenance, but I seriously doubt you'd know what those are." Without hesitation, Rachel stood and walked toward aisle 12. The Marines followed, expecting her to fumble around or admit defeat. Instead, she stopped at a specific shelf and pulled down a box of rubber-washered bolts designed for high-impact applications. "These should work for your rifle modifications," she said matter-of-factly. "They're rated for repeated stress and have excellent shock absorption properties." The Marines stared at the exact items they needed, but their surprise quickly morphed back into mockery. Brooks recovered first. "Lucky guess," he muttered, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. As they headed toward the checkout counter, Webb made one final comment that cut through the store's ambient noise like a blade. "I bet the closest you've ever come to combat is fighting with the price scanner." Rachel's hand stilled on the register keys. For just a moment, something flickered behind her eyes, something cold and distant that made the temperature in the store seem to drop several degrees. "I used to fight different battles," she said quietly, her voice carrying an odd quality that made Brooks look at her more carefully, where the stakes were a bit higher than hardware sales. The Marines laughed, assuming she was making some kind of joke about difficult customers. They grabbed their bags and headed for the door, still chuckling about the war stories from the hardware lady. But Tom Bradley, who had been restocking paint cans and overheard the entire exchange, noticed something that made him pause. For just a moment, when Rachel had spoken about different battles, her entire posture had changed. Her shoulders had squared, Her voice had carried a quiet authority he'd never heard before, and her eyes had held a hardness that seemed completely at odds with the mild-mannered employee he thought he knew. After the Marines left, Tom approached Rachel's station. "You okay? Those guys were pretty rude." Rachel was already back to her inventory. Her moment of intensity completely vanished. "I'm fine. People make assumptions. It's human nature." But Tom couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Rachel Thompson than met the eye. The way she'd known exactly what those Marines needed, the precise terminology she'd used, and especially that moment when her entire demeanor had shifted it. All pointed to knowledge and experience that went far beyond retail work. That evening, Tom found himself wondering about his quiet employee. In 2 years, Rachel had never mentioned family, never talked about previous jobs, and never shared personal details the way most employees did. Her employment application had been sparse, no military service listed, no college education mentioned, just a previous address in California and a reference from a temp agency that had since closed. He'd hired her because she'd been reliable during her trial period, and because she clearly knew her way around tools and hardware. But now he was starting to suspect that Rachel Thompson's knowledge came from somewhere much more serious than a hardware store training manual. The next morning, Rachel arrived at work to find the same group of Marines browsing the tool section. This time, they were with an older man in civilian clothes who carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of career military. Staff Sergeant Michael Rodriguez had been training young Marines for 15 years, and he brought this group to Henderson Hardware for a practical exercise in procurement and equipment evaluation. What he didn't expect was to notice the woman behind the counter whose movements and posture triggered his instincts. Rodriguez observed Rachel from across the store as she helped a customer select the right drill bits. There was something about the way she handled the tools, not like someone who'd learned from retail training, but like someone with muscle memory built from repetitive, precise use. When Brooks and his squad started making jokes about asking the hardware lady about military tactics, Rodriguez felt his jaw tighten. He'd seen enough young Marines underestimate people based on appearances, and it never ended well. But it was what happened next that made Rodriguez's blood run cold. As Rachel reached up to pull a heavy box from a high shelf, her sleeve rode up just enough to reveal a small tattoo on her inner wrist. Most people would have missed it, but Rodriguez had been in the Marines for 2 decades. He knew exactly what he was looking at. The eagle, globe, and anchor were standard, but the crosshair overlay and the small 3 beneath it were not. That particular combination was only worn by Marines from 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, and only by those with very specific, very deadly skills. Rodriguez felt his heart rate spike. If Rachel Thompson was who he thought she might be, then these young Marines had just made the mistake of their lives. He decided to wait and watch, but something told him that the quiet woman behind the counter was about to teach his squad a lesson they'd never forget. The mockery continued for the next 2 weeks, and each incident chipped away at Rachel's carefully constructed armor of indifference. Brooks and his Marines had turned their visits to Henderson Hardware into a regular entertainment, bringing different friends to witness their harassment of the clueless hardware lady. On Friday afternoon, they crossed a line that even Rachel's considerable patience couldn't ignore. She was helping an elderly veteran named Frank Kowalski find replacement parts for his garage door opener when Brooks and 3 Marines she hadn't seen before entered the store. Frank had served in Vietnam and always treated Rachel with the respect she was rarely shown by other customers. "The springs you need are in aisle 5, Rachel was explaining to Frank. "But given the age of your opener, you might want to consider upgrading the safety cables too." Brooks spotted them and loudly announced to his companions, "Oh, perfect. It's story time. Watch this." He swaggered over to where Rachel and Frank were standing. "Hey there, Hardware lady, Brooks said with exaggerated friendliness. My buddies here don't believe me when I tell them about your vast military expertise. Want to share some of your war stories? Frank's face hardened. As a combat veteran, he recognized mockery when he heard it, and it made his blood boil. Son, you might want to watch your tone. Brooks turned his attention to Frank with a patronizing smile. And who are you, Pops? Her commanding officer? Actually, Frank said, his voice carrying decades of authority, I'm someone who knows. Disrespect when I see it. This lady has been nothing but helpful to me, and you're being a punk. The confrontation was escalating quickly. Other customers had stopped shopping to watch, and Tom emerged from the back office, sensing trouble. Brooks' friend, a Marine named Kevin Walsh, decided to make the situation worse. Look, Grandpa, we're just having fun. Nobody's getting hurt. But if you want to defend your girlfriend here, maybe you should ask her about her extensive combat experience first. Walsh grabbed a small American flag from the patriotic display near the register and waved it mockingly. Come on, hardware lady. Tell us about all the battles you've won. I bet you were real tough behind that desk at the VA or wherever you served. The flag comment hit Rachel like a physical blow. She watched Walsh wave the symbol she'd once sworn to defend, treating it like a prop in his cruel joke, and something inside her finally snapped. For 2 years, she'd absorbed every insult, every dismissive comment, every assumption about her capabilities. She'd built a life based on being underestimated and overlooked. But watching these young Marines, who should have known better, mock everything she'd once held sacred, was more than she could endure. Put the flag down, Rachel said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made several customers look up in surprise. Walsh laughed. What are you going to do about it? File a complaint with customer service? Rachel stepped closer and, for the first time since anyone at Henderson Hardware had known her, she let her true nature show. Her posture straightened, her shoulders squared, and her eyes took on the cold intensity of someone who'd faced life and death decisions and never flinched. I said put it down. The change in her demeanor was so dramatic that Walsh actually took a step back. Brooks, however, was too invested in his performance to read the warning signs. Oh, look guys, the hardware lady's getting tough. What's next? You going to throw a wrench at us? Tom had seen enough. He stepped forward, ready to ask the Marines to leave, but before he could speak, Rachel did something that stunned everyone in the store. She walked to the tool display, picked up a 16-ounce framing hammer, and with a motion so smooth it seemed choreographed, threw it 20 feet across the store. The hammer struck a small bell hanging from the promotional display with perfect precision, making it ring once before the hammer clattered to the floor. The store fell completely silent. Brooks and his friends stared at the bell, still swaying slightly from the impact. The throw had been impossibly accurate, a casual demonstration of hand-eye coordination that spoke to years of training with far more dangerous projectiles. Muscle memory, Rachel said simply, her voice still carrying the new, harder edge. Some things you never forget. Frank Kowalski looked at Rachel with new eyes, recognition dawning on his weathered face. Tom felt a chill run down his spine as he realized he'd been working alongside someone with capabilities he'd never imagined. But it was Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, who had been quietly browsing power tools in the back corner of the store, who understood exactly what he'd just witnessed. The casual precision, the effortless accuracy, the way Rachel had handled the hammer like an extension of her own hand. These weren't the skills of someone who'd learned to throw things for fun. These were the skills of someone who'd been trained to kill. Brooks, shaken but trying to maintain his bravado, attempted one last jab. Nice trick. I bet that's the most action you've seen in years. Rachel looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke, Her words were measured and final. "You have no idea what action I've seen. But you're about to find out that assumptions can be dangerous, especially when you make them about the wrong person." She turned and walked toward Tom's office, leaving behind a store full of people who suddenly realized they'd been completely wrong about Rachel Thompson. Rodriguez watched her go, his mind racing. If his suspicions were correct, these young Marines had just provoked someone who could make them all disappear without breaking a sweat. The question was, what was she going to do about it? Staff Sergeant Rodriguez couldn't sleep that night. The image of Rachel's precise hammer throw kept replaying in his mind, along with the glimpse of her tattoo and the way she'd handled herself during the confrontation. He'd been around enough special operations personnel to recognize the signs, and everything about Rachel Thompson screamed elite training. Early Saturday morning, Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He drove to the Marine base in 29 Palms and used his security clearance to access personnel databases that most people never knew existed. It took him 3 hours of careful searching, cross-referencing names, service dates, and unit assignments, but finally he found what he was looking for. The file made his hands shake. Thompson, Rachel Marie, former Staff Sergeant, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, military occupational specialty, 0317 Scout Sniper. Service record, classified. Discharge, medical, combat-related PTSD. Awards, Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Navy Commendation Medal with Combat V. But it was the final entry that made Rodriguez's blood run cold. Operation Phantom Strike, All Anbar Province. Single-shot neutralized high-value target at 1,247 meters during sandstorm conditions, preventing planned assault on forward operating base. Recommended for Navy Cross. Call sign, Viper 9. Rodriguez stared at the screen in disbelief. Viper 9 was a legend in Marine sniper circles. The shot in Al Anbar Province was still taught at sniper school as an example of impossible precision under extreme conditions. The Marine who'd made that shot had saved an entire company from a coordinated attack, and she'd done it in weather conditions that should have made accurate fire impossible. And she was working at a hardware store in Millbrook, California. Rodriguez thought about Brooks and his squad, remembering their cruel jokes and mocking behavior. They had no idea they'd been taunting one of the most lethal Marines in Corps history, a woman who'd earned her reputation in the deadliest combat zones in Iraq and Afghanistan. He made 2 phone calls that afternoon. The first was to his old friend Captain Lisa Warren, who ran the civilian marksmanship program at Camp Pendleton. The second was to Tom Bradley at Henderson Hardware. "Tom, this is Mike Rodriguez. I was in your store yesterday during that incident with the Marines. I'd like to make you an offer." "What kind of offer?" "We're having a civilian shooting event next Saturday at the range. Community outreach, teaching basic marksmanship to interested civilians. I'd like to invite your employee, Rachel, to help with instruction." Tom was quiet for a moment. "Mike, I don't think Rachel is really the shooting type. She's pretty quiet, keeps to herself." Rodriguez almost laughed at the irony. "Tom, trust me on this. I think Rachel might have more experience with firearms than you realize. Would you ask her?" That Monday, Tom approached Rachel during her lunch break. She was sitting alone in the break room, reading a paperback novel and eating a sandwich she'd brought from home. "Rachel, I got an interesting call over the weekend. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez from the Marine base wants to invite you to help with a civilian marksmanship event this Saturday." Rachel's book slipped from her hands. For just a moment, naked fear flashed across her face before she regained her composure. "I don't think that's something I'd be interested in," she said carefully. "You seem to think you might have some experience with firearms." said they could use someone with practical knowledge to help teach basic safety and technique. Rachel was quiet for a long time, staring at her hands. Tom could see an internal struggle playing out behind her eyes. "What did you tell him?" "I said I'd ask you." "But Rachel ... Tom hesitated, then decided to be direct. "Who are you really?" "I've worked with you for 2 years, and I'm starting to realize I don't know anything about you." Rachel looked up at him, and Tom saw something in her expression he'd never seen before: vulnerability mixed with exhaustion. "I'm someone who used to be very good at things I'd rather forget," she said quietly. "Someone who came here because I thought I could disappear and live a normal life. The way you handled yourself on Friday, the way you threw that hammer, that wasn't normal, Rachel." She was quiet for another long moment. "No, it wasn't. Will you consider Rodriguez's invitation?" Rachel closed her book and wrapped up the rest of her sandwich, her movements careful and deliberate. "I'll think about it." But Tom could see the decision forming in her eyes. Something about the confrontation with Brooks and his Marines had awakened something in Rachel that she'd been trying to keep buried. Wednesday evening, Rachel drove to a sporting goods store 3 towns over, paying cash for items she hadn't touched in 3 years: shooting glasses, ear protection, and a small range bag. Her hands trembled slightly as she made the purchases, but her voice was steady when she called Rodriguez that night. "Sergeant Rodriguez? This is Rachel Thompson. Tom Bradley said you wanted to talk to me about this Saturday." "Yes, ma'am. We could really use someone with your experience." Rachel was quiet for a moment. "What exactly do you know about my experience?" Rodriguez's voice was respectful but direct. "I know enough to understand that those Marines on Friday had no idea who they were talking to. And I know enough to believe that maybe it's time they learned." Another long pause. "What time on Saturday?" 8 a.m.? And Rachel? "Thank you." After she hung up, Rachel sat in her small apartment and stared at the Purple Heart she kept hidden in her bedroom drawer. For 3 years, she told herself that Rachel Thompson, the hardware clerk, was her real identity now. That staff sergeant Thompson, call sign Viper 9, was someone who no longer existed, but Brooks and his Marines had shattered that illusion. They'd reminded her that some people only understood respect when it was earned through demonstration rather than granted, through basic human decency. Saturday was going to be a very educational day. Saturday morning arrived gray and cold, with fog rolling in from the coast that reduced visibility to less than 100 yards. Rachel sat in her truck in the parking lot of the Millbrook Civilian shooting range, her hands gripping the steering wheel as she fought an internal war. She'd changed clothes 3 times that morning, finally settling on old woodland camouflage pants and a faded Marine Corps t-shirt that she'd kept hidden in the back of her closet. The clothes felt strange after 2 years of red hardware store vests, but they also felt like coming home. Rodriguez spotted her truck and walked over, tapping gently on the window. "You ready for this?" Rachel rolled down the window, and Rodriguez was struck by the transformation. Gone was the mild-mannered hardware clerk. The woman looking back at him had the focused intensity of someone who'd spent years making life-and-death decisions. "I haven't done this in 3 years," she said. "It's like riding a bike. Except the bike is a precision rifle and the road is a 1,000-yard shooting range." Despite herself, Rachel smiled. "That's a terrible analogy, Sergeant." "Yeah, I'm better with rifles than metaphors. Come on, let me show you around." The range was already busy with civilian participants' families, teenagers interested in military service, and competitive shooters looking to improve their skills. Rodriguez led Rachel to the equipment table where she quietly helped organize rifles, check safety equipment, and assist newcomers with basic stance and breathing techniques. For the first hour, Rachel remained in the background, content to be invisible again. but Rodriguez watched her work with growing admiration. She had an intuitive understanding of how to teach marksmanship, making small corrections that dramatically improved each shooter's accuracy. A young woman named Ashley was struggling with her grip when Rachel quietly approached. "Try adjusting your support hand placement," Rachel suggested, making a gentle correction. "And remember to breathe. The rifle fires when your body is at its most relaxed point." Ashley's next shot hit the target dead center, her best of the day. "How did you know to do that?" Rachel just smiled and moved on to help the next shooter. What neither Rachel nor Rodriguez noticed was the familiar sound of loud voices approaching from the parking lot. Brooks and his Marines had decided to spend their Saturday showing off for the civilian participants, unaware that their favorite target was already there. The Marines swagger onto the range with typical bravado, Brooks leading the pack with his chest puffed out and his voice carrying across the entire facility. "Mind if we show these folks how real Marines handle weapons?" Brooks announced to Rodriguez. Rodriguez felt his jaw clench, but he maintained his composure. "Follow all safety protocols, and you're welcome to participate." The Marines set up at the 100-yard line, drawing attention from the civilian shooters with their loud commentary and exaggerated movements. They were competent marksmen. Basic training had seen to that, but their technique was sloppy and their attitude was worse. After a few rounds, Walsh spotted Rachel helping clean up equipment at a nearby table. He elbowed Brooks and pointed in her direction. "Wow, look who's here," Brooks said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It's our friend from the hardware store." "What are you doing here, sweetheart?" Finally decided to learn about real weapons. The range fell quiet as everyone turned to watch the confrontation. Rachel continued organizing equipment cases, not responding to the taunt. "I bet she's never even held a rifle," Webb chimed in, playing to his audience. "Probably thinks the safety is the same as a power drill." Rodriguez stepped forward, ready to intervene, but Rachel finally looked up from the equipment table. Her expression was calm, almost serene, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly across the range. "I've held a few rifles in my time." Brooks laughed and picked up a challenge coin from the equipment table, a tradition among Marines for settling disputes. "Tell you what, hardware lady, see that target at 200 yards? I'll put this coin on it. If you can hit it, I'll personally apologize for every joke I've ever made. When you miss, you admit you don't belong here and stop pretending to know about guns." The other Marines laughed and encouraged him, while the civilian participants watched with growing discomfort. Several of them had seen Rachel's quiet expertise throughout the morning and suspected Brooks was making a serious mistake. Rodriguez held out his personal rifle, a precision instrument he'd maintained for 15 years. "Rachel, would you mind settling this?" Rachel looked at the weapon, then at Rodriguez, then at the gathering crowd. She could walk away. She could let Brooks have his moment and return to her quiet life at the hardware store. She could keep pretending to be someone she wasn't. Instead, she reached for the rifle. Brooks jogged down to the 200-yard target and taped a coin to the center. It was a standard challenge coin, about the size of a quarter, nearly impossible to hit at that distance, even under perfect conditions. With the morning fog, it was barely visible. As Brooks jogged back, making theatrical gestures for his audience, Rachel knelt and began examining the rifle. She checked the scope, tested the bolt action, and felt the weapon's balance. It had been 3 years since she'd held a precision rifle, but the movements came back as naturally as breathing. The range fell completely silent. Even Brooks' Marines sensed that something significant was about to happen. Rachel pulled her old baseball cap low over her eyes and settled into the prone position. The familiar calm settled over her, the same focused clarity that had kept her alive through 3 combat deployments. She controlled her breathing, calculating wind drift, distance, the slight tremor in her hands from too much coffee, and the way the fog would affect visibility. All the variables that had once meant the difference between saving lives and watching good Marines die. The shot echoed across the range like thunder. The coin exploded into two perfect halves. The silence that followed was deafening. Brooks stood frozen, his mouth hanging open. The other Marines looked like they'd seen a ghost. The civilian participants began whispering among themselves in amazement. Rodriguez stepped forward, his voice carrying across the entire range with unmistakable pride and authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to meet Staff Sergeant Rachel Thompson, call sign Viper 9, formerly of 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. She holds the record for longest confirmed kill in desert conditions and saved 8 Marines with a single shot in Al Anbar province." Brooks found his voice first, but it came out as barely a whisper. "My single quotes and ... I had no idea. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." But Rachel was already standing, handing the rifle back to Rodriguez. Without another word, she walked toward the parking lot, leaving behind a crowd of people who would never forget what they'd witnessed. Behind her, Brooks and his Marines stood in stunned silence, finally understanding that they'd spent weeks mocking one of the most lethal Marines in Corps history. The quiet hardware store clerk was gone. In her place stood Viper 9, and her legend was about to spread far beyond the shooting range. By Monday morning, the story of what happened at the shooting range had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. The civilian participants had posted videos on social media. Rodriguez had shared the story with his contacts at the base. And Brooks, to his credit, had spent the weekend telling anyone who would listen about his profound mistake. Rachel returned to work expecting everything to go back to normal, but normal no longer existed for her. Tom Bradley was waiting when she arrived, holding a printed newspaper article he'd found online. Marine Sniper Saved Squad in Heroic Long-Range Shot. The accompanying photo showed a much younger Rachel in full combat gear, her face partially obscured by camouflage paint and tactical equipment. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tom asked, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and hurt. Rachel hung up her jacket and put on her red vest with the same methodical precision she'd always shown. "Because I wanted to be Rachel Thompson, who works at a hardware store, not Staff Sergeant Thompson, who used to kill people for a living." Tom studied the article again, reading details about the classified operation that had made her famous within Marine sniper circles. "The person described in this article saved lives, Rachel. She's a hero." "That person also took lives," Rachel replied quietly. "And heroes don't usually end up with PTSD nightmares and medical discharge papers." Their conversation was interrupted by the bell above the front door. Brooks entered alone, his usual swagger completely absent. He approached Rachel's station with obvious nervousness. "Ma'am, I wanted to apologize properly. What I said, what we all said ... There's no excuse for that level of disrespect." Rachel looked up from her inventory sheets. "You didn't know, Tyler. People make assumptions based on appearances. It's human nature. That's no excuse for treating anyone the way we treated you." "But ma single quote some ... Can I ask you something?" Rachel nodded. "When you said you used to fight battles where the stakes were higher than hardware sales, I never understood what that meant until Saturday. What was it like? Being responsible for other people's lives?" Rachel was quiet for a long moment, considering how much truth to share with this young Marine, who was barely older than some of the soldiers she'd protected overseas. "It was the most important thing I ever did," she said finally. "And the hardest thing I'll ever carry. When you're responsible for lives, Tyler, every decision matters. Every shot has consequences that ripple out in ways you can't imagine." Brooks nodded solemnly. "Will you teach us?" "My squad, I mean. We're shipping out to Afghanistan in 8 weeks, and after Saturday ... we realized we don't know anything about real combat. Rachel felt her chest tighten. These young Marines were about to face the same dangers she'd survived, and their lives might depend on lessons she could teach them. "I'll think about it," she said. Over the next few days, Henderson Hardware became an unofficial pilgrimage site for Marines from the local base. They came in small groups, not to buy anything, but to pay their respects to a legend they'd heard about, but never expected to meet. Word had also reached the civilian community. Veterans who'd served in Iraq and Afghanistan began stopping by. Some just to shake Rachel's hand, others to share their own stories of combat and homecoming. On Wednesday, an elderly man named Robert Chun entered the store and asked specifically for Rachel. Tom directed him to her station, where he waited patiently while she finished helping another customer. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," he said when she turned to him. "My name is Robert Chun. My grandson, Corporal David Chun, served with your unit in Al-Anbar province." Rachel's face went pale. She remembered David Chun, 19 years old, 3 weeks in country, killed by an IED while on patrol. She'd been the one to radio in the casualty report. "Mr. Chun," she said softly, "I'm so sorry for your loss." "Don't apologize," he said. Firmly, "David wrote to us about you. He said you looked out for the new guys, taught them how to stay alive. He said you were the best Marine he'd ever served with." Rachel felt tears threatening to spill over, but she held them back. "David wrote home about the night you saved the FOB," Mr. Chun continued. "He said 8 Marines came home because of your shot. 8 families didn't get the phone call we got." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small American flag. "Been the same kind that was given to families of fallen soldiers. David would have wanted you to have this. He believed that heroes should be recognized, even when they don't want to be." Rachel accepted the pin with trembling hands, her carefully constructed emotional walls finally beginning to crack. "Thank you, Mr. Chun. David was a good Marine. He deserved better than what happened to him." "He got what he signed up for," Mr. Chun replied. "The chance to serve alongside Marines like you." After he left, Rachel sat alone in the break room. During her lunch, staring at the flag pin and thinking about David Chun's bright smile and his eagerness to prove himself. She thought about all the young Marines she'd served with, the ones who'd made it home and the ones who hadn't. For the first time in 3 years, Rachel began to consider that maybe hiding from her past wasn't the same as healing from it. That evening, Rodriguez called her at home. "Rachel, I've got a request. The Marine Corps is sending a delegation to evaluate our civilian outreach programs next month. They want to see real community engagement, and after Saturday... Well, your story could make a difference for programs like this across the country. What are you asking, Mike?" "I'm asking if you consider being our keynote speaker. Share your story. Talk about transition from military to civilian life. Maybe demonstrate that incredible shooting ability for some visiting brass." Rachel was quiet for a long time. "I'll need to think about it. I understand. But Rachel, what you did Saturday changed those young Marines. Brooks has been a different person since then, more respectful, more serious about his training. Sometimes people need to see what excellence looks like before they can aspire to it themselves." After hanging up, Rachel walked to her bedroom closet and pulled out a box she hadn't opened in 3 years. Inside were her military decorations, commendation letters, and a photo of her old squad taken 2 weeks before the mission that had made her famous. Looking at those young faces, some of whom hadn't made it home, Rachel realized that Mr. Chun was right. Heroes should be recognized, not because they wanted recognition, but because their example could inspire others to be better. Brooks and his squad weren't the only young Marines who needed to understand what true service looked like. And maybe, just maybe, stepping out of the shadows could help her find peace with the person she used to be. The quiet life of Rachel Thompson hardware store clerk was officially over. What remained to be seen was what kind of life Rachel Thompson, Marine veteran, would choose to build in its place. 3 weeks later, the Marine Corps' delegation arrived at the Millbrook Civilian shooting range for what was supposed to be a routine evaluation of community outreach programs. What they got instead was a demonstration that would be talked about in Marine circles for years to come. Colonel James Harrison had flown in from Quantico specifically to assess the effectiveness of civilian marksmanship programs. He was a decorated combat veteran himself, skeptical of feel-good community initiatives that seemed more focused on public relations and actual military readiness. Rodriguez had set up a comprehensive display of the program's achievements, safety training records, marksmanship improvement statistics, and testimonials from civilian participants. But his secret weapon was Rachel Thompson. She arrived at the range in her dress blue uniform cleaned and pressed for the first time in 3 years. The ribbons on her chest told a story of exceptional service: Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device, Purple Heart, Navy Commendation Medal with Combat 5, and several others that immediately caught Colonel Harrison's attention. "Staff Sergeant Thompson," Harrison said, studying her ribbon rack with professional interest. "Impressive record. Rodriguez tells me you've been instrumental in improving this program's effectiveness." "I've been helping with basic instruction, sir," Rachel replied with the crisp professionalism that had served her well during 8 years of active duty. "Rodriguez also tells me you hold some kind of marksmanship record. Care to elaborate?" Before Rachel could respond, a commotion erupted from the parking lot. Brooks and his Marines had arrived, but they weren't alone. Word of Rachel's identity had spread throughout the base, and nearly 50 Marines had shown up to watch what they'd heard was going to be an extraordinary demonstration. Among them was Major Patricia Wells, the base's senior marksmanship instructor, who had driven down specifically to meet the legendary Viper 9. "Colonel Harrison," Major Wells approached with barely contained excitement. "Sir, you need to understand what you're about to witness. Staff Sergeant Thompson's shot in Al-Anbar province is still taught at sniper school. What she accomplished under those conditions was theoretically impossible." Harrison's skepticism began to shift toward genuine interest. "What exactly are we talking about, Major?" Rodriguez stepped forward with a rangefinder and pointed toward the far end of the facility. "Sir, we've set up targets at incremental distances. The furthest is at 800 yards, the maximum effective range of this facility." 800 yards? Harrison looked impressed despite himself. "That's serious long-range shooting." "Yes, sir," Rodriguez replied. But according to military records, Staff Sergeant Thompson's longest confirmed kill was at 1,247 meters. In a sandstorm, the crowd of Marines had grown larger, with word spreading rapidly through text messages and phone calls. Young Marines, who'd only heard whispered stories about legendary snipers, were about to witness a piece of military history. Brooks approached Rachel with obvious nervousness. Over the past 3 weeks, he'd become something of an evangelist for proper respect and military courtesy, largely because of his encounter with her. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say thank you for what you taught us about assumptions and respect. My whole squad is different now." Rachel nodded acknowledgement, but her focus was shifting into the zone she remembered from combat. The familiar calm was settling over her, the same focused clarity that had kept her alive through 3 deployments. Major Wells had brought a precision rifle that represented the current state of military marksmanship technology, a far cry from the standard equipment Rachel had used during her service years. "Staff Sergeant, this is an M110 semi-automatic sniper system with advanced optics and ballistic computer integration. It's considerably more sophisticated than what you would have used in theater." Rachel examined the weapon with the careful attention of someone who understood that her life had once depended on such examinations. It's impressive technology, ma'am. But technology is only as good as the Marine behind it. Harrison stepped forward. Staff Sergeant, I'm curious about your perspective on modern marksmanship training. Do you believe current methods adequately prepare Marines for combat conditions? Rachel considered the question carefully. Sir, range training is essential for building fundamentals. But combat shooting is different. In combat, you're not shooting at paper targets in perfect weather conditions. You're shooting to save lives when everything around you is chaos. Care to demonstrate the difference? This was the moment Rodriguez had been building toward. He'd set up a scenario that would test not just Rachel's marksmanship skills, but her ability to perform under pressure. We've prepared a combat simulation, Rodriguez announced to the crowd. Multiple targets at varying distances, time constraints, and environmental challenges designed to approximate field conditions. Rachel accepted the rifle and moved to the firing line. The crowd of Marines fell silent, understanding that they were about to witness something extraordinary. The first target appeared at 200 yards, an easy shot for any trained Marine. Rachel fired without hesitation, center mass hit. The second target appeared at 400 yards, this time partially obscured by artificial smoke. Another perfect shot. But it was the third target that made everyone hold their breath. At 600 yards, in crosswind conditions, with a timer counting down and artificial stress sounds playing through speakers, Rachel had to hit a target the size of a dinner plate. She controlled her breathing, calculated the wind drift, and fired. Perfect center hit. The crowd erupted in cheers, but Rachel wasn't finished. Rodriguez had saved the most challenging scenario for last. Final target, he announced. 800 yards, maximum range of this facility. Wind speed 15 miles per hour from the northwest. Target size, 4 inches. Carl Harrison stepped closer. 4 inches at 800 yards? That's an impossible shot. Rachel looked at him with the quiet confidence of someone who'd accomplished the impossible before. Sir, in Al-Anbar province, the target was 3 inches at 1,247 meters. In a sandstorm, with lives depending on the outcome. She settled into position for the final shot. The range fell completely silent, except for the sound of wind through the trees. Rachel's breathing slowed to almost nothing as she entered the zone that had made her legendary. The shot echoed across the range like thunder. 800 yards away, the 4-inch target exploded into fragments. The silence that followed was profound. 50 Marines stood in stunned amazement at what they'd just witnessed. Colonel Harrison stared downrange through binoculars, unable to believe what he'd seen. Major Wells spoke first, her voice filled with awe. That was ... that was impossible. The ballistics alone ... Rachel stood and handed the rifle back to Major Wells. Ma'am, with respect, impossible is just another word for something that hasn't been done yet. Brooks stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the range. Ladies and gentlemen, that's what a real Marine looks like. The crowd erupted in sustained applause and cheers. Marines who'd spent their careers pursuing excellence had just seen what true mastery looked like. But for Rachel, the demonstration wasn't about showing off. It was about reminding these young Marines that their training had a purpose beyond scores and competitions. Somewhere, in some future combat zone, their skills might mean the difference between their brothers and sisters coming home or not. Colonel Harrison approached Rachel with obvious respect. Staff Sergeant Thompson, I came here expecting a routine program evaluation. What I witnessed today was a demonstration of Marine Corps' excellence that I'll remember for the rest of my career. Thank you, sir, but this isn't about me. It's about making sure these young Marines understand what they're capable of when they commit to excellence. Harrison nodded, then turned to address the crowd. Marines, what you've seen today represents the absolute pinnacle of military marksmanship. But more importantly, you've seen what dedication, training, and service to others can accomplish. As the crowd began to disperse, Brooks approached Rachel one final time. "Ma'am, you changed my life. Not just because of what you did today, but because of how you handled yourself when we were disrespecting you. You showed us what grace under pressure really means." Rachel looked at this young Marine who'd grown so much in just a few weeks. "Tyler, take care of your Marines when you deploy. Bring them all home." "Yes, ma'am, we will." As Rachel walked toward her truck, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Pride. Not in her shooting ability, but in the knowledge that she'd helped shape young Marines who would carry forward the values of honor, courage, and commitment. The demonstration was over, but its impact would last for years to come. 6 months after the demonstration that had made her famous throughout the Marine Corps, Rachel Thompson stood before a packed auditorium at the annual Veterans Transition Conference in San Diego. The quiet hardware store clerk who'd spent 2 years trying to disappear had become one of the most sought-after speakers on military to civilian transition. But this speech was different. This time, Brooks and his entire squad were in the audience back from their deployment in Afghanistan, all of them alive and whole. "When I took that job at Henderson Hardware," Rachel began, her voice carrying clearly through the auditorium, "I thought I was running away from who I used to be. I thought Rachel Thompson, the veteran, was someone I needed to bury so Rachel Thompson, the civilian, could survive." The audience, a mix of active duty personnel, veterans, and family members, listened with rapt attention. "I was wrong. You can't outrun your past, and more importantly, you shouldn't try to. Our military service isn't something we need to hide from or apologize for. It's something we need to integrate into the people we're becoming." In the third row, Brooks wiped away tears as he remembered the scared young Marine who'd mocked this woman 6 months earlier. His deployment had been different because of the lessons she taught him, not just about marksmanship, but about respect, humility, and the responsibility that came with being a Marine. "I learned something important from a group of young Marines who thought they were teaching me a lesson about my place in the world," Rachel continued with a slight smile. "They reminded me that hiding your light doesn't make anyone else shine brighter. It just makes the world a little bit darker." She looked directly at Brooks and his squad. "Those Marines also taught me that sometimes the people who challenge us the most are the ones who help us grow the most." After the speech, Brooks approached the stage with his squad. They were different men than the ones who'd mocked her at the hardware store, more serious, more respectful, more aware of the weight of their responsibilities. "Ma'am," Brooks said, his voice thick with emotion, "we wanted to thank you, not just for what you taught us at the range, but for how you handled yourself when we were being jerks. You could have destroyed us that first day, but instead you waited until we were ready to learn." Sergeant Walsh, who'd been the one waving the flag mockingly months earlier, stepped forward. "Ma'am, I carry this everywhere now." He pulled a small American flag pin from his pocket, the same kind Mr. Chun had given Rachel. "It reminds me that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn." Rachel looked at these young Marines who'd grown so much in such a short time. "How was the deployment?" "Different than we expected," Brooks replied. "But we were ready because of what you taught us. We brought everyone home. That's all that matters." Tom Bradley appeared from the crowd, still wearing the same paint-stained apron he'd worn at Henderson Hardware. Rachel had convinced him to attend the conference, hoping to show him how much his support had meant during her transition. "I still can't believe I had a legendary Marine sniper organizing my screw inventory for 2 years," Tom said with a grin. "And I still can't believe you put up with all my baggage without asking questions," Rachel replied. "Speaking of which, Tom pulled out a folded piece of paper. I brought you something. It was a job posting for a new position, Veterans Transition Coordinator at Henderson Hardware, partnering with local military bases to provide employment, opportunities, and mentorship for transitioning service members. The corporate office approved it after they heard about everything that happened. They want you to design a program that other stores can replicate nationwide. Rachel stared at the job description, realizing it was exactly what she'd been looking for without knowing it's a way to use her military experience to help others, while staying connected to the civilian community that had accepted her. When do I start? 3 months later, Rachel stood in the same hardware store where her journey had begun, but everything was different. The walls now displayed photos of veteran employees, information about military transition resources, and a prominent display case containing her military decorations, not for glorification, but to remind young veterans that success in civilian life was possible. She was training a new employee, a young woman named Maria Santos, who'd recently separated from the Army after 2 tours in Iraq. Maria was struggling with the transition, feeling invisible and undervalued in ways that Rachel remembered all too well. The hardest part, Rachel told Maria as they organized inventory together, is learning that civilian life moves at a different pace. The stakes feel lower, but that doesn't mean the work matters less. How do you handle the customers who assume you don't know anything? Maria asked. Rachel smiled, remembering her own struggles with condescending customers. I remind myself that their assumptions say more about them than they do about me. And sometimes, if they're really persistent, I let them find out they're wrong in ways they'll never forget. The bell above the front door chimed, and Rodriguez entered with a new group of Marines, young, eager, and probably full of the same assumptions that Brooks and his squad had carried months earlier. Rachel, Rodriguez called out, I'd like you to meet the newest class from sniper school. They're doing a community service project, and I thought they might benefit from meeting you. Rachel looked at the young Marines, seeing herself at their age confident, skilled, and utterly unprepared for how much they still had to learn about life. Welcome to Henderson Hardware, she said with a warm smile. How can we help you today? As she guided them through the store, explaining their project and sharing insights about military to civilian transition, Rachel reflected on how much her life had changed. She was no longer hiding from her past or running from her identity. She was Staff Sergeant Rachel Thompson, call sign Viper 9, veteran of 3 combat deployments, holder of the Silver Star, and currently the best hardware store employee in California. All of those identities were true, and all of them were part of who she'd chosen to become. The young Marines listened respectfully as she spoke, understanding that they were in the presence of someone who'd walked the path they were just beginning. Some of them would remember this conversation years later, when they faced their own transitions and needed to remember that heroes come in all forms, including the quiet ones who choose to serve others even after their war is over. As the group prepared to leave, one of the young Marines lingered behind. Ma'am, he said quietly, my father told me to look you up if I ever made it to California. He said you saved his life in Al-Anbar province. Sergeant David Walker? Rachel's breath caught. She remembered Sergeant Walker, Jimmy Walker, trapped in a building surrounded by insurgents, until her shot had eliminated the threat. Jimmy Walker's son, she said softly. He talked about you all the time. Showed everyone pictures of his boy who was going to be a Marine someday. Yes, ma'am, he's the reason I enlisted. And he told me that if I ever met you, I should tell you that he named me after you. My name is David Rachel Walker. Rachel felt tears threatening to spill over, but this time she didn't fight them. Your father was a good Marine and a good man. I'm honored to meet you. Ma'am, he wanted me to give you this if I ever found you. Young Walker pulled out a worn challenge coin, the same one his father had carried through 3 deployments. He said heroes should have reminders of the lives they've saved. As Rachel accepted the coin, she realized that her story had come full circle. She'd started as a Marine protecting others, spent time hiding from that identity, and now she was, once again, in a position to serve and protect, just in a different uniform. The hardware store had become her new battleground, where she fought against assumptions, prejudice, and the idea that worth was determined by appearance rather than character. It was a quieter war than the one she'd fought overseas, but it was no less important. As the young Marines left, Rachel returned to her work with Maria, helping train the next generation of veteran employees. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows of Henderson Hardware, illuminating the quiet dignity of ordinary people doing extraordinary work. Outside, the world continued to spin with all its challenges and conflicts. But inside, in a small hardware store in Millbrook, California, Staff Sergeant Rachel Thompson was still standing watch, protecting not just the lives of fellow veterans, but the idea that everyone deserved respect, regardless of how they looked or where they came from. Some heroes wear uniforms. Others wear red vests and name tags. But all of them understand that true service means lifting others up, whether with a precision rifle shot or a patient explanation of the difference between a carriage bolt and a hex bolt. Rachel Thompson had finally found her place in the world, not by running from who she used to be, but by embracing all the pieces of herself and using them to make the world a little bit better, one interaction at a time. The quiet Marine was still serving her country. She just had a different uniform now. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world. Rachel's journey reminds us that heroes walk among us every day, often in the most unexpected places. Have you ever encountered someone who surprised you with their hidden talents or background? Share your own stories of unexpected heroes in the comments below. Thanks for joining us for another incredible true story. Until next time, remember that respect is earned through character, not assumptions, and that extraordinary people often choose to live ordinary lives while quietly making the world a better place.